All right, cool. All right, thanks everyone for joining. This session is part of Centric's Regenerative Action Ambassador Series, Speaker Series. On the call today, we've got our ambassadors as well as a few members of the extended Centric community. So welcome everyone, thank you for coming. Neal, our ambassadors have all committed to taking some kind of land-based climate action to create the conditions for our Earth to heal. As part of the ambassador program, we get together about twice a month to support each other in community as we pursue our separate projects. And then at one of those meetings, we hear from a guest speaker. So thank you so much for coming today. We're very stoked to have you. So before I hand it over to Neal, let me tell you a little bit about him. Neal jumped into a pretty epic regenerative project at Al Baida in the Saudi desert after getting his permaculture design certificate and learning how to green the desert with permaculture expert Jeff Lawton. And then currently, Neal is developing regenerative seawater agriculture systems that can help transform the 25,000 miles of degraded coastal desert into complex, climate beneficial ecosystems that can produce food and jobs. I'm super stoked to hear how Neal got to where he is today and what he's looking forward to. So please join me in welcoming Neal Spackman. Neal, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Kyle. Hi, everybody. I'm on a giant beanbag in my basement because the family's upstairs eating dinner. But what Kyle and Diana asked me to talk about was my regenerative journey. And my journey really starts the summer after first grade. When I was 8 years old, I grew up. My dad was at the Mayo Clinic for 40 years for his career. I was a doctor's kid. And the summer after my first grade, we went to a little island in the Caribbean called St. Lucia, which is still the poorest island in the Caribbean. And my dad did volunteer work at the hospital, working with their surgeons and their physicians on different kinds of things. And my parents' objective in doing that was to expose us as their kids, and I have 4 siblings, I'm the middle of 5, was to expose us to how other folks live. And so we lived in a 1-room shack. I had bed bugs for 3 months, and got a view of, a community of people living much closer to the land than I was. A view of poverty, and a view of the global South, as a kid. And then when I was 19, I went on an LDS mission to Guatemala. And in Guatemala, I again interacted much more closely with rural people in the global South, and in particular corn farmers, right? They're all people of the corn down in Guatemala. And I remember an experience where I was helping someone work on their water infrastructure, and they were telling me about how their corn crop was failing and they were going to have to abandon their home and move into the city to try to make it. And that was a really visceral experience for me. It was seeing that experience of land degradation leading to an abandonment of land, leading to, rural poverty, leading to urban migrancy, and all the challenges that come along with that. And those are global patterns. They're happening everywhere. But I was very up close and personal, and friends with people who were going through that. And at the same time, while I was living in Guatemala, 9/11 happened. And so when I moved back to the States from Guatemala, I had a serious interest in, sustainability in food systems and sustainability in the built environment, but also a deep curiosity about the Middle East. I had, the months prior to 9/11, I had spent a good chunk of time with a Tunisian smuggler who was the first Muslim guy I had ever really interacted with and talked religion with. And we liked each other quite a bit. he said he was a gold merchant, but there's no gold in Guatemala, but there is a lot of smuggling. So it's a presumption on my part that that's what he was doing. But I'm pretty sure that is the case. But the juxtaposition between the positive experiences I had with that gentleman and the shock of 9/11 made me really curious about the Middle East. So when I went home, I took an Arabic course. I took an Islamic history course. Really liked both of them, and ended up changing my major from pre-med to Middle East Studies, Arabic, and economics. And got proficient at Arabic. Spent time in Egypt as a student. Studied and lived on a. I lived in Alexandria for half a year in an apartment that was right on a street market. And so I would go to classes in the morning, and then starting around 5 p.m., I would sit with these, lower middle class Egyptian gentlemen. One ran a tea shop across the street. One was a butcher. One was a plumber. One sold household goods. And they would sit and play backgammon and smoke and deal with clients as they came up. And I would sit with these guys for 5 or 6 hours a day. And they would help me to learn Arabic and read the newspaper. And we'd talk everything, right? We talked politics. We talked religion. We talked geography. We talked history. We talked everything. And they kind of taught me Arabic as it was spoken in Egypt during the days of Mubarak. And that's where I really developed knowledge of the Middle East and culture and all kinds of familiarity with a region that otherwise is very, very foreign. So I had this passion about food systems and sustainability and the built environment. When I graduated undergrad, I got a job doing media analysis on the Middle East. I would read 14 or 15 newspapers in Arabic every day. I'd write reports, and then those reports would get purchased by various entities of the US government, State Department, the Pentagon. Every now and then someone at the White House would pick it up, the intelligence community. But I was doing like open source media analysis kind of stuff. And hated it, but was making decent money, and was prepping to go apprentice with a gentleman named Yanto Evans. Does anyone know who Yanto is? Yanto's the godfather of the American cob movement. Cob is a mud building technology. It's like a free form Adobe where you mix sand and clay and straw at certain ratios, and then you can do this like free form architecture that's very curvilinear and very indigenous, and very high performance as well. And Yanto built himself a small village in Southern Oregon, and every year he takes on an apprentice and teaches them. So I was saving up money to do that. And instead I was invited to go join Al Bayda. And when and so the opportunity kind of fell in my lap. And when it did, I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. So I quit my job, moved to Jeddah. I actually had the Al Bayda job before I did my permaculture course. I told the people at Al Bayda, I said, look, before we start any of this, I need a little bit of training, and we need to bring in a bunch of consultants that can help get us in the right direction. And that was when I pivoted from, wanting to do regenerative stuff into actually doing it. And I wasn't hired into that job because I had a ton of experience transforming land. I was hired into that job because they needed a foreigner who knew the language and knew the culture and wasn't going to mess around. Right? It was more for my social and leadership and cultural abilities than for anything having to do with the land. We said, we'll figure out the land, we'll bring in the right people, and I'll be the guy on the ground leading the stuff and being the go-between between, the princess and her team and the Bedouin out in the desert. And I ran Al Bayla from 2010 to the middle of 2018. And I'm assuming all of you have seen the video because Diana said she told you to watch it. But so I won't go into too much detail on it until we get to Q&A if you want to follow up on it. But Al Bayla was, a deep learning on the job kind of experience. And the beauty of it, that there were a lot of beautiful things about El Bayda, but one of the beautiful things was I had absolutely no red tape at all. I had absolute free reign where they said, if you think something's going to work, try it out on a small scale. And then if it works, we'll build it out. But if it doesn't, then we know it didn't work. And so we ran hundreds of little experiments in El Bayla, some of which failed quite spectacularly, and a few of which succeeded beyond what we thought was possible. But absolutely no restrictions on what we could try, no permits ever required, no red tape, just if you think it'll work, go give it a shot. Within the restrictions of a budget, and within the restriction of if it's really out there, do it small first, right? So that we don't have a disaster on our hands. One of the other beautiful things was, after a couple years, the trust that my team and I had with each other, and that the project funders and I had with each other, allowed us to really utilize indigenous knowledge and to understand what indigenous knowledge was there and what historical land use had been, and then to tweak it in the context of bringing land back into productivity and bringing ecosystems back to life. That trust, without that trust, it would have been impossible. And without the willingness of people to share, it's amazing what people won't share when they don't trust you. Because some things that, may seem very benign to an outsider or harmless may actually be very closely held by somebody else. So I left El Bayla for good in 2018. We'd kind of proved the system. We didn't have the funding to expand. We had put in for a much larger site, 5,000 acres or so. We'd asked the governor to grant us 5,000 acres to do a commercial scale version of what we had learned on that 100-acre prototype. And he said yes, but then 17 other ministries came in and said no. They said no. Every ministry, and it's not 17 ministries. It was 17 different government bureaucracies, all said they had a claim on some part of it, some way, and so it just became a political impossibility. Even before the question of funding came in, it just, at that point in time, expansion within El Bayla became impossible. And so I, had this inflection point, and I'd been running a nonprofit for 8 years, and I decided that whatever I did next needed to be profitable so that it could be financially self-sustaining. I don't know how many of you have run a nonprofit before, but 50% of the job is begging really well, right? You got to convince a lot of people or a few people with a whole lot of money to fund whatever it is you're doing, and for them it's charity. And so I said, I'm going to go to business school and figure out, how do I utilize markets to fund ecosystem restoration and regenerative development. So I spent a year, I went to Stanford for a year, got a business degree. While I was there, I met my current partners at Regenerative Resources, who are pioneers in something called seawater agriculture and have been working on it for about 40 years. And that was primarily under the auspices of a gentleman named Carl Hodges. Does anybody know that name? Carl passed away 2 years ago. He was our founding science officer. He was a rather notorious scientist in his day, because he's the one who, through his work at a group called the Environmental Research Lab at the University of Arizona, he was the founder of that lab. And through his work at that lab, he invented shrimp aquaculture. He was the first in the world to figure out how to get shrimp to reproduce in captivity. And the shrimp aquaculture industry now is a $60 billion global industry, but Carl invented it. And shortly after, he also was an early pioneer in greenhouse agriculture in hyperarid zones. I got a photo of him. I'll share some pictures while I'm talking. Here is Carl in 1971, the founder of the United Arab Emirates. Hold on, I'll make it bigger. This is Carl Hodges, and this is the founder of the UAE, Sheikh Zayed, on Saadiyat Island in 1972. And Carl was invited to the Emirates, and you can see he's got a military escort there guarding the Sheikh, and looking at the plants. But Carl realized in the 70s that fresh water was going to be a major issue, that there isn't going to be enough water to grow all the food, at least not sustainably. And after his work with aquaculture, he decided, okay, well, if there's not enough fresh water, the only thing left is seawater. And he dedicated the rest of his life to figuring out how to sustainably produce food with seawater, which led to the aquaculture, but also to what we call seawater agriculture systems. So this is a Salicornia farm in Bayaquino, Mexico, that my partners ran for about 25 years. And this is a farm irrigated with untreated seawater. And they did some aquaculture here, but they also did the halophytic agriculture. And in this one, they're growing Salicornia. Salicornia is also known as sea beans or sea asparagus. And it's got, as a crop, it's got application in alternative proteins, in biofuels, in cooking oil, in animal fodder, and in the production of nutraceuticals, pharmaceuticals, and a couple other of those ceuticals. This was prototyped by Carl and his team, where they said, okay, what if we pump seawater onto the land and grow plants that love seawater and start to develop them as crops? And that's, even today, 50 years later from when he started, it's still a revolutionary idea. This is a commercial farm they did in Eritrea. And this is seawater that had been through an aquaculture system. So it's loaded with nitrogen and phosphorus from the fish waste, and it's irrigating, hundreds of acres of Salicornia crop, which they use to feed the camels of the local Bedouin tribes, and which they also use to produce cooking oil and to sell as vegetables. This was the first commercial seawater agriculture project outside of the US, outside of the Environmental Research Lab. This was a 50,000 hectare project they proposed in Egypt. 50,000 hectares is about 120,000 acres. This is 6 times the size of Manhattan Island. And they spent about 3 years on the feasibility for this. It was approved by Hosni Mubarak, who was president of Egypt at the time, in December of 2010, I believe. And then February of 2011, the Arab Spring happened, and Hosni Mubarak was ousted, and this project never happened. But President Mubarak approved it, had approved Egyptian bank funding for this project, which was about a $500 million project. And then the Arab Spring shelved the whole thing. This is Albeida stuff, which I don't need to show you. Since starting Regenerative Resources, I've been consulting to pay the bills while we try to fund our own projects. One of those projects that I'm quite proud of is part of the Frontline, the Great Green Wall of Africa in Gambia, where we're working with about 30 different communities on the north bank of the Gambia River, where the farmers' rice fields have become so salty that they can't grow rice anymore. And so the pattern that shows up everywhere is agriculture leads to ecological degradation, which leads to failure of the agriculture, which leads to abandonment and poverty. That a universal cycle happening on every continent. It's happened multiple times in the last 10,000 years of row crop agriculture. And so this project that I'm an advisor to, but that I help them with the strategy and the feasibility, there's 18,000 hectares of mangrove restoration that we're doing. Plus we are integrating investment into commercializing their oyster industry and turning it into an export industry, as well as integrated seawater agricultures utilizing mangrove agroforestry and tilapia systems, and then baobab agroforestry as well. This project is probably a $300 million project overall. Will sequester about 6 million tons of carbon over a 30-year history. But most importantly, it will create regenerative economic systems that helps these people who have been the cause of degradation. It helps them become stewards of that land rather than the degraders of that land. In a way that it cares for them, cares for their families and their communities, and cares for the earth. This one is ongoing. We planted 500,000 mangroves last year on the Pacific coast of Mexico. This is an area called Delgadito. It's in a UNESCO biosphere, where we're pursuing about 4,500 hectares of mangroves and another 4,500 hectares of seagrasses. And there's this project was actually selected in November to develop UNESCO's first biodiversity credits. So we are in the process of figuring that out. We will be, assuming things go well, we'll be producing biodiversity credits that are UNESCO branded as soon as next year. And that should fund a great deal of the restoration and the establishment of agroecological systems that allow the fishery to be rehabilitated, that give the local people jobs, and increases the profitability of their systems. There's more I could show you. Delgadito and Gambia are two of these projects that I'm allowed to tell you about. I've got a bunch of others that are mostly under NDA, including in Saudi, in the UAE, in Texas, in Panama, Somaliland, Namibia, all of which are moving at their own speed, and which I'm a consultant or an advisor to, and sometimes they get really intense, and I need to fly over somewhere for 3 weeks and spend time with folks, and then I may leave it alone for a year. The projects we are doing under regenerative resources have to do with regenerative aquacultures, where we are using mangrove agroforestry and halophytic agricultures to create constructed wetlands and absorb the pollution from onshore aquacultures. We are currently funding a project in Texas. It will be the first regenerative onshore aquaculture farm in the Western Hemisphere. Looking at between a $5 and $30 million raise and taking that to market within 4 weeks, where we will produce shrimp as the main revenue driver, but also a little bit of salicornia and sarcocornia animal fodder. But it will be a circular regenerative onshore system that, it will produce ecosystem services that we will measure. I can't make claims right now about what we'll see in Texas, beyond what we could extrapolate from the experiences in East Africa. But that's not really an apples to apples comparison. And that's, I can go into all sorts of detail on what this land transformation takes. I can get into finance, I can get into enterprise creation, I can get into multi-trophic systems. It's just a question of what you folks are interested in and where you'd like this conversation to go. But that's my life story. I've been interested in the interaction of ecology and food systems and wealth or poverty since I was an 8-year-old kid in the Caribbean, observing what was around me in St. Lucia, and don't see myself ever not being interested in that.
Neal, thank you very much. I know I have a million questions, but this isn't about me. So, Rawers, please ask away.
So I have a question on the, my name is Cindy Clement. I'm in Texas. Can you hear me?
Hi, Cindy.
So when you're doing these aquaculture shrimp farms,
Yep.
how is it not industrial farming, and is it regenerative and support ecosystems?
Are you
If it's
familiar
one
with
crop.
how most onshore aquacultures operate? Cindy, are you?
Onshore aquacultures, somewhat. So explain to me how this is different.
Yeah, so I'll pull up a photo of a farm in Sonora. This is in Mexico. And this is an actual photo with some commentary. Oh, no, not that button, this button. So this is a photo, and most and we'll talk about shrimp since this is going to be a shrimp farm. Shrimp farms tend to be giant ponds, right? And a shrimp farmer will buy, 1,000 acres of coastal land, and they convert it into these big ponds. What they do is they pump the ocean water into these ponds, and they grow their shrimp, and they dump all the wastewater back into the ocean. And so you'll get ecosystem loss from the pond digging. Shrimp farms are the largest cause of mangrove degradation in Asia, for instance, because they'll clear mangrove forest to grow those, to create those ponds. And then when they dump their wastewater into the ocean, they create dead zones that are functionally, you get a swath of nitrogen in the water that gets consumed by microalgae, which also consumes all the oxygen, and then all the fish die. The other part of it is because they're polluting the ocean water, because that ocean water is their source of water, they end up polluting their own farms, and they get diseases among their crop. And so there are things like Vibrio or white spot disease are two of the big ones that shrimp farmers are terrified of. But their own system is the thing that creates the habitat for those diseases to flourish, right? Primarily through nitrogen overload. And that's a conventional shrimp farm system, right? So they're destroying two different ecosystems in general and polluting their own farm and generating the cause of their own downfall in the form of recycling shrimp waste back into the shrimp farms and creating habitat for diseases. What we do is instead of dumping that wastewater into the ocean, we use it to grow mangrove agroforestry systems. So that pollution problem becomes a fertilizer solution. And then we use that agroforestry to grow the feed for the shrimp. And this is part of our intellectual property. But when shrimp lay their eggs, they lay their eggs in mangroves. And when shrimp hatch from their eggs until the point they become adults, biodegrading mangrove leaves are their primary food. That's what shrimp evolved eating, is degrading mangrove leaves and microalgae and detritus. And so just like cattle should be eating grass, shrimp should be eating mangroves. And so we have, in that constructed wetland, we get a massive increase in biodiversity. We get local cooling. We get a recharge of the small water cycle. We get carbon sequestration, and we produce inputs to our farms that drastically improve the health and the cost of raising that shrimp. And there's no pollution to the ocean ever. So that's the primary difference between our system versus a conventional system is we intensify the production. So we're not doing extensive systems in the ponds, but our wastewater grows constructed wetlands that allow us to restore blue ecosystems, create ecosystem services themselves, and give us healthier shrimp.
Thank you.
Neal, may I follow up with that? If the pumps for those systems died, would those constructed mangroves be able to continue, or is it primarily they exist because of the pumps bringing in water from the sea?
They'd die.
They die. Okay.
Yep. Unless we have a site that's below sea level,
Mm-hmm.
right? In Eritrea, they minimized pumping and energy usage by having a constructed river that at high tide that they could actually fill it.
Mm.
And then the pumping was minimal. I mean, there are ways to reduce energy usage, but functionally it's a man-made system that's replicating the ecosystem services of mangroves.
And are those systems, what is the mechanism to power that? Can they be solar powered? Is it electricity?
Yeah, generally they're electric pumps. I got a partner who's really interested in Archimedes pumps that he thinks could be driven by wave action entirely. But right now it's in Eritrea, they did solar pumping. Project in Oman, we're likely to do solar. If wave power were more reliable and had a longer longevity of those systems, I'd really love to do it with wave power, because then it's almost totally passive beyond the hardware.
Yeah.
But right now we prefer solar or nuclear, because then we can still probably do carbon credits on it.
And is there something as a consumer to look for? I would like to eat those shrimp. Is that regenerative shrimp? Is there a marketing definition?
We are recording this, and I
me-
was planning to post it on YouTube.
Give
so,
me a year, Donna Lees, and where do you live? Because we're going to be producing in Texas, hopefully.
Northern California, not too far away.
Yeah, we'll ship it to you if you keep in touch with me.
Done.
All right. Anyone else?
Hey, Kim, do you want to ask your question about carbon credits and sequestration?
If you have it there, go ahead and read it.
Okay, cool. So Kim sent us a question ahead of time here. So he says, due to some questionable data quality of several carbon sequestration projects regarding carbon credits and company reporting, there's increasing scrutiny in the quality and metrics, metrics and results of all carbon accounting. To what extent might you be concerned about increased effort and financial costs to ensure your projects meet these increased standards?
I'm not at all concerned about it. I think there needs to be a lot more scrutiny. For us, the carbon's just a cherry on top. None of our financial models rely on the carbon finance. It's for us, it's a little bonus. And the fact of the matter is that if we're going to rely on carbon finance for ecosystem restoration, we've got to recognize that finance is temporary, right? Usually those deals are 30-year deals where they say, oh, we're going to pay the local people not to destroy this ecosystem, right? And so the question is, well, what happens after 30 years? And one of the metrics that I like to talk about in carbon markets is permanence. If you want to restore a forest, right, or mangroves or seagrasses or whatever it may be, and you want that restoration to be long lasting, then you've got to create an economy that doesn't rely on the degradation of that ecosystem. Right. And that's where I think carbon credits in nature-based solutions and in ecosystems are destined to fail unless they incorporate that regenerative economic system building. Because right now, the reason we degrade ecosystems is because we want an economy. Right? Whether you're looking at agriculture or mining or forestry, right, or fisheries, it's all about economy. And I'll share a story about a project in Ghana that we helped with. In Ghana, we were in an area that's where near the delta east of Accra, and the fishing villages there are facing a total collapse of their fishery. They've seen a 90% drop in their catch in the last decade. All right. So all their costs are the same. Their boat costs, their fuel, their nets, but they're catching 10% of the fish they're used to catching. And when that happens and you're facing total poverty, you're like, okay, what's the next resource I can exploit to put food on my table? Right. And usually it's mangroves. Right. People will cut mangroves for firewood or to build fish traps. And then the fishery collapses even further because mangroves are the nurseries of the ocean, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species of fish put their eggs in the mangroves. You clear those mangroves out, all of a sudden those fish don't have habitat and the fishery degrades even further. And so there's this downward spiral of poverty and ecological degradation where they are intricately connected. And the fact that we treat environmental issues and economic issues as if they're separate is a huge problem, because you can't solve any of those sets of issues without recognizing how connected they are. And that's what regenerative systems do, is they recognize that you can't have an economy without a functioning ecology, and address those things together. But yeah, I think we need a lot more scrutiny. I think carbon markets are rife with fraud and bad actors and people who see a growing market and want to make a buck and don't really care about the ecosystem that's supposed to be sequestering this carbon. So I welcome the scrutiny. I think it's very important.
Oh,
Hey, Neal. Hey, everybody. Hi, Kyle. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, my name is Cole. I was invited to listen to Neal, and I wanted to listen to Neal because Neal and I believe, what was
Facebook.
was it is it Facebook, or I thought like during the pandemic, we were all using this platform to just have conversations that were thematic. Didn't we talk then too? I'm sure.
Maybe, but I thought it was Facebook.
Whatever. Well, this is me in the flesh and you in the flesh and all these new friends in the flesh digitally. Hi.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm really inspired. Pardon, I was eating a piece of cinnamon sugar toast. My question to you is actually a little bit less technical and more on about your story and your path. Your experience working in the nonprofit sector versus private sector, have you experienced, you personally, do you feel that there's a greater potential to get things done in private industry because the nature of nonprofit is that you are half of your time is trying to recharge with finances?
Yeah.
What's your experience been in the nonprofit and for-profit sector in terms of impact potential?
I mean, nonprofit, I had a Saudi princess funding, right?
Mhm.
So fundraising for Al-Baida was relatively easy compared to other nonprofits.
Mhm.
But funding still ran out, right? At some point, the people said, okay, we've learned what we wanted to learn, or they had something happen. I don't actually know the reason why.
Mhm.
And then everything kind of had to stop, right?
Mhm.
Now, luckily, the ecosystem hasn't stopped. In fact, that site has gotten greener every year since 2016, and we have the satellite data to prove it. And so we went through that process of taking, a hyper arid, deforested, denuded landscape and converting it back into a dryland savanna, and it's acting like a dryland savanna now. And the impact of that was quite significant. And we've had, I think, over 1 million people have watched my video. And there is now a national program to re-green Saudi Arabia. And I can't go into detail of my involvement with that, but I am involved. And Al-Baida is seen as one of the prototypes that proves it's possible, right? So the impact there is quite significant. But I also think that's a very, very unique kind of situation. That's not like a replicable experience. I can't teach other people, oh yeah, just get in with some royal family and convince them. It's not something that can be duplicated easily. Whereas if we can get this regenerative aquaculture thing going, the potential for impact is significantly more than Al-Baida was. I mean, if I have my druthers, we will grow 1 billion mangroves before I retire. We'll create thousands of jobs and provide habitat for billions of animals. And that's because you can make money doing it. And just looking at the amount of resources available, right? The total amount of philanthropy globally is, I don't know, it's billions, right? Of total philanthropy available every year, and 2% of that goes to environmental issues. Meanwhile, there's $6 trillion sloshing around capital markets looking for a place to land. And so if you can attract the trillions, and redirect it into regenerative systems, you've just got a much bigger wad of cash to play with, let's say. And if you are successful, then you can attract a lot more. And so it's the opposite, because you're not begging for it. People are saying, let me put my money in your system because I know I'm going to get money out of it. And even if they don't care about the environmental stuff, right? Doesn't matter because I care about that, and that's what my systems do. Right. And so and towards the end of Albeda, I kind of had for me, it was a turning point. And I was like, well, do I want to do nonprofit still? Do I want to try to do for-profit? And I also considered running for public office. I was like, which of these things can I make the biggest difference with?
Yeah.
Right. And the answer I came up with was start a business.
Yeah.
That's a very American attitude, very American attitude. People in other countries would probably come up with different answers, but that's the one I came up with.
Great. Thank you, Neal. I appreciate that.
bet.
I'm an entrepreneur it just is the most natural space for me, but I also operate very closely in the nonprofit space as well. And I think for us who have the entrepreneurial spirit, or anyone in general, I think about who I interact with every day, what landscapes I interact with, who is my customer base. I think very locally because I run animals in a watershed that I operate them in. And so when I think about mass impact, it's not going, I think that there's also similarity. My personal goal is like, how many people, animals, and acres can I impact in my lifetime? But it all has to, start locally. And that's kind of the toggle I have with business and nonprofit, where your scope can be a lot broader and you're cultivating perhaps a culture, nurturing a culture around something that is important, that does good, versus impacting potentially locally on a smaller scale economically. I think that's an interesting thing, is all of us on our journey is, where we best place for what part of the impact barometer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an individual decision.
Right. Personality and context based too.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. You've got a hand up, Isaiah or Isaiah.
Yeah, Isaiah. Neal, first off, just want to thank you. I'm sure, everyone on the call shares that, like, you're an inspiration. You're doing it. Appreciate how you embed yourself into local cultures, how you go for these audacious projects and do them, how you're tying a business model to regenerative. Like, really, thank you. My question is two-part. One is kind of like, there's so much climate doom and anxiety, and it's almost like it gets worse by the day. Some people say we have until 2030. There's all these theories. I'm curious how you think of that in general. And then second to that is, I imagine it's not doom and gloom for you, or I imagine you haven't given up, obviously. What do you think are the most high leverage areas, kind of going forward, that maybe we can think of and maybe incorporate into our work?
So on the first piece, there's a principle called circle of influence, where you've got, if you imagine all the things that you can affect with, your resources and your network and your personality and your reach or your followers, whatever it is, right? You've got a circle of influence. And if you focus on things that are within your circle of influence, then your circle of influence will expand, right? That you will be able to have a greater impact if you focus on the things that you can affect. Whereas if you focus on the things that are outside of your circle of influence, your circle of influence will shrink. And you will lose the ability to impact things. And your power as an individual will diminish. And so part of the way my brain works is I'm able to compartmentalize a whole lot of stuff. But I've also learned to just say, you know, that thing over there that is so bad or so troublesome is outside of my power, right? And if I can't do anything about it, then I'm not going to worry about it, because worrying about it actually shrinks my influence. And that ability to compartmentalize is kind of a curse and kind of a blessing, but that's how I deal with that. Is the other part of it is, I mean, I read a hold on, what's the language? An Ugaritic inscription this morning. It just, my older brother is big into dead languages, and I saw this thing where this, you know, these people had carved into a sandstone, you know, tablet, you know, the youth are all corrupted, all the leaders are bad, you know, the fields are not producing as much, and the end of the world is close at hand, right? You know, and that's from 4000 BC. The inclination toward doomerism is I think a part of the human experience. I think all of us can experience one way or another. But one thing about predictions is that they look at what it is now and they look at trends and they say, okay, if nothing changes, then, you know, it's going to be really bad in 10 years or whatever it is, right? And there's truth to that. But the thing about Homo sapiens is we're the most adaptable species in the history of the planet. That really is our comparative advantage, is we adapt to everything. And we make changes in all sorts of things, and we are problem solvers. And so when we understand problems well enough, people put their attention and their energy into solving them. And so it's important to look at those trends and say, yeah, everything's really screwed up if we don't make any changes. But our history as a species shows that making changes and adapting is probably the thing we are best at. What was the second part of your question, Isaiah?
It was the highest leverage kind of areas to affect
Yeah.
change. Yeah.
I mean, really, I feel like, you know, energy is a really big one. Energy is also one where there's tremendous amount of resources and brain power focused on energy, right? And what the energy, I mean, we live in the oil age. We've been in the oil age for about 115 years. And when the Saudis and the Emiratis are actively making policy around building a post-oil economy, which is what all of their national policy is focused on, right? If you look up Saudi's Vision 2030, it's all about building a post-oil economy, right? The most oil-dependent nations on the planet are preparing for a world without oil as the most important source of energy. And that means that, you know, the transition is already underway. I don't know how long it's going to take, but we're not going to move beyond oil because we run out of it. That's not what's going to happen. We didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stone. What's going to happen is we're going to figure out something that works better, and eventually oil will be more valuable leaving it in the ground than taking it out. That's how we move beyond the oil age. So energy is a big one, but it's also very crowded. beyond that, the whole regenerative movement is trying to end, 12,000 years of patterns. I don't know how many of you have read Montgomery's book Dirt. It's called Dirt: The Erosion of Civilization. And he goes into how soil erosion has caused, military expansionism in multiple civilizations, right? He talks about how erosion of soil has been a major driver in civilizational change, going all the way back to the Sumerians. The patterns playing out as it relates to nature and food are not new. They're accelerated right now compared to in the past. And, we live everywhere, right? There isn't anywhere to expand to the way, a branch of the Sumerians broke off when the Euphrates became over-salinized, and they started the Phoenician civilization after denuding the mountains in Lebanon, right? That opportunity is not there anymore. There's people everywhere. And so there's all kinds of stuff that comes in here, but I think that's the revolutionary thing about regenerative systems is we're trying to take, the proof of what indigenous peoples have proven, which is that we can coexist with nature and foster nature and be a keystone species while caring for our own needs, and caring for our own civilizations, and making that widespread and innovating, new indigenous systems that work with technology and work with, our population levels. That's one of the macro things that I like about it, is that we're trying to change 12,000 years of patterns here, and go, in some ways, go back to patterns that are much older, but that are, adapted to today's conditions. I feel like that's a much longer term problem than energy is how do we transition humanity to being a keystone species? It's kind of revolutionary. It's kind of out there. But that's where I've put my energy. And that has to do with policy making. It has to do with traditions. It has to do with markets. It has to do with our financial system. A lot of people would answer your question with money. A lot of people would say, we got to change how money works. That's the most impactful thing you could do. And there's all kinds of like Web3 regenerative groups with that narrative. And I've written an essay along those lines, where I advocated for changing accounting to account for externalities in nature. But that's kind of a rambling answer to your question.
Thank you.
With a smattering of my own thoughts.
Hey, Neal, we are a minute past 6 p.m. here. I just wanted to make sure that we're respecting everyone's time. If you've got another 10 minutes or so for a couple more questions, we can keep going. But if you've got a jet, that's totally cool too.
I thought we were going to 7:30 actually.
Oh man, okay.
I scheduled you another half hour. That we can end now if you want.
No, this is great. Let's keep going. I actually have a hard stop in 15 minutes, but we can figure that out as we go. So, all right. Diana had a question, and since she's not here today, I'm going to ask for her. She said, could you talk a bit more about building trust in a community and how you do that?
Yeah, this is not a satisfactory answer, but you have to be trustworthy.
Mm.
The way you get people's trust is by being trustworthy. There's no way else to do it. Not if you really want it. Like you can try to manipulate people, but eventually they see through it and then you're out, right? Once people figure it out, then you're out. You got to be trustworthy. You've got to do what you say you're going to do, and you've got to not impose things on people that they're not ready for, or that may not even work. And I'll give you an example. I think I've shared this. Maybe this might be in Judy's book. I don't know if this is in your book, Judy, but my deputy in Al-Bayda was a gentleman named Khamis Al-Jahdali. And Khamis was in his 60s back then. He's now in his 70s. And I grew up with a leadership style that was very consultative, where based on councils and based on, you help people feel included by asking them what their opinion is and asking them to contribute. And that's what I thought good leadership was. And so I was pursuing that style of leadership with the Bedouin, where I'd bring everyone together in a group and I'd say, okay, we're facing this challenge. What do you guys think we should do? And at one point, Khamis took me aside one-on-one, and he said, and he was so straightforward with this, but he said, Neal, how come you're such a crappy leader? And I was like, well, what do you mean, Khamis? And he said, well, when you ask everyone what they think we should do, it makes you look like you don't know what you're doing. And besides, if you ask everybody, nobody's going to answer, because the way we work, if you're in a group, only one person has the right to speak, and that's the elder, that's the sheikh. He's like, so there's no point in doing that. And I said, well, what would make you more comfortable, Khamis? And he said, tell us what to do and we'll just do it. Right? That was his culture's perception of good leadership, right? I wasn't a bad leader. I was leading the way that I learned to lead. And then he told me that's super wrong here, right? He didn't realize that it was a style. He just said, good leadership is you tell us what to do and quit asking us. And so whenever I completely changed how I behaved with that team after that, because I realized that I was making them uncomfortable with my culture of leadership, and that they had a totally different culture. So I became a dictator with that team at Khamis's request. And when I did, they became so much more comfortable at work. Just remarkable change in behavior, and in their comfort with me as a leader of the team, right? And to me it was nuts, right? I was like, I would hate this style of leadership if I were one of these guys, but they liked it, and that's what they wanted, and it made them trust me more when I adopted their culture of leadership rather than going on with mine. So there's cultural issues at play, especially when you're a foreigner in a foreign land, and that was a learning experience for me, right? I'd lived, when I moved to Saudi, I had already lived in the Middle East for over a year, and I'd also spent years in Latin America, and some time in Europe, but this lesson of cultures of leadership hadn't really it hadn't been applicable to me yet. Like, I knew about it from a book perspective, but I hadn't lived it the way I did that.
Nice, thank you. Trisha, do you want to go?
Yeah, I had a question that's a little bit less about regenerative agriculture and more just kind of like an opinion-based question. But in the news the past 2 days, they've been talking about the rain in Dubai.
Yeah.
And how they like kind of use this I don't know the exact word for this technology, but they basically like
Cloud
allowed it to. Yeah. My question is, what is your opinion on technology like that? And it's what role does it play with, or what role doesn't it play with regenerative agriculture? And I mean, because you work in the desert.
all deserts flood.
Mhm.
Right. That's part of what makes a desert is when it rains, it floods. Right. And it's a question of how are you equipped to handle that water when it comes, right? Because there are you familiar, Tricia, with the concept of effective rainfall?
Yeah.
Effect, yeah. So it's a question of how much of the rainfall is effective.
Mhm.
And in this case, it appears that there was I don't know how much of this flood is due to cloud seeding versus just due to nature. And maybe it's both of them compounding on each other to create what was a disastrous occurrence. But the other part of it is having the infrastructure in place to handle that water. It's not clear to me that if you cloud seed in one area, that you get less rain in a different one. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know what the downstream effects are in terms of the atmosphere. But one thing that Dubai ought to have prepared for is how to turn this problem of floods into a solution of, we got all this fresh water, let's put it to use and use it as a resource. And they weren't prepared to do that, right? They didn't. And there's systems of, natural infrastructure, or they call it green infrastructure, where and that was half of Albeida was a natural infrastructure system to harvest the water. Dubai is not equipped to harvest the water right now, and so it's all going to be wasted. It's running right into the Gulf, which is a shame, because if this is a result of cloud seeding, they said, you know what, we need a lot more water. And then they got a lot more water, and they couldn't actually put it to use. So it seems a waste on both ends, right? Do I think it's an appropriate technology to use? I would counter that with, what are the alternatives, right? If the only other way to get fresh water is desalination, then it becomes a lesser of two evil questions to me, right? Because you can't just say, well, guess what, Dubai, you don't get to have fresh water because, desal is unsustainable and cloud seeding is unsustainable. It's that's just a great way to get yourself thrown out of the conversation.
Makes sense.
Do I have time to jump in with one more question?
Go for it.
Yeah, go for it.
So you talked about innovating new indigenous ideas.
Yep.
That would work with today's technology and be adaptable to conditions of populations.
Yep.
And that's something that's come up for me a lot in the work that I'm doing with looking at regenerative practice, recognizing that its roots are all based in practices that people came from across the ocean, drew a bunch of lines and ruined. And
Sure.
now we're going back into tribal lands saying, hey, we want to help. And there feels like there's something, and you talked about Bedouin populations, so I'm talking about Native American populations when I speak of indigenous culture, but you can apply it obviously all over the world. So I'm just wondering, from your experiences and talking about trustworthiness and cultural respect and those differences, what you might have to say about regenerative practice coming back to these lands that it has extracted to be its solution.
Yeah, I mean, it gets really thorny. For me personally, I don't go somewhere unless I'm invited to go. right? That's the first thing is I want an invitation to give my advice before I'm going to start giving it. One, because I don't want to waste time and give advice where it's not wanted. And two, because I think it's respectful. I think you can't going in and trying to impose things doesn't work. It's just fundamentally a failure of a way to approach things, right? And so having an invitation is really important because it establishes consent. But it also begins with a recognition of, we may want some external help to deal with this. And both of those things are really important. Beyond that, I don't know how much of this is going back, right? We look at indigenous systems as proof that regenerative stuff can work. But I think more importantly than that, it's proof that our species can be beneficial. But that it's almost a noble savage stereotype to go with that narrative too. And so there's a lot of nuance in this and a lot of detail that needs to be very local. Right. And when I talk about new indigenous systems, it's less about what did people used to do and more about how do we create something that allows for nature and people to thrive. And not all indigenous systems are that, but indigenous systems are the proof that that has existed before and that we are capable of building them. In terms of, the socio and the cultural side of this, people can get very prickly if you offer your advice uninvited, right? And there's this whole concept of white saviorism. There's this whole concept of sovereignty and indigeneity, and they're all they're not fixed concepts. They're all kind of evolving concepts. But fundamentally, I think if people have the same vision of, okay, we got to take care of the planet and we got to take care of people, and how do we do that? I think if you can keep that vision and unite people around that vision, then questions of identity become a lot less important. Not because because identity isn't important to individuals, but because people can unify around a common cause, rather than getting caught up in what belongs to who and who gets to say what.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I unfortunately need to go. I'm happy to transfer the host to Katrina if folks have more questions. So I'm going to do that now. I think I have to stop the recording. So I'm going to say thank you to Neal so much for joining us today.